Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. The Widow's Last Evening. Edith Pembroke sat in her parlor, knitting with the steady rhythm of someone deep in thought. The soft clacking of needles was the only sound in the room, save for the occasional rustling of a newspaper from across the hearth. She had spent the afternoon writing letters, though none had yet been posted. Her evening cup of tea sat untouched on the small table beside her. A late night for you, Mrs. Pembroke, said Lillian Hargrove, stepping in from the doorway. Her voice held the polite warmth of a concerned neighbor, but her eyes flicked toward the pile of correspondence on the writing desk. Edith did not look up. One must settle certain affairs before it is too late. Lillian hesitated. Nothing troubling you, I hope. Edith's fingers tightened over the yarn. Some matters do not concern others, Lillian. She turned a sharp gaze toward her visitor. But you know that already, don't you? Lillian's face paled, but before she could respond, Edith resumed knitting. The tension in the room grew thick. The silence stretched between them until Lillian forced a small laugh. Well, if you need anything, do let me know. She stepped back toward the door. A lady should not worry too much at night. Edith gave a thin smile, eyes never leaving her needles. Quite right. The following morning, Miss Jane Marple was making her way toward the village post office when she noticed something peculiar. The curtains at Mrs. Pembroke's cottage remained drawn, the milk bottle still standing by the door. Edith was an early riser, a woman of precise habits. The sight made Miss Marple pause. By mid-morning, concern had spread through the village. No one had seen Mrs. Pembroke when her housekeeper finally arrived to check on her. She found the front door unlocked, the breakfast table undisturbed, and Edith Pembroke gone. The postmistress, Mrs. Weatherby, was the first to whisper the word vanished. Inspector Grayson arrived at the scene just past noon, his expression one of professional disinterest. He was a man accustomed to more pressing cases than the simple disappearance of an elderly widow. No signs of a struggle, he remarked, surveying the neat sitting room. No forced entry. Perhaps she went out early and forgot to return. She was not the forgetful type, Miss Marple said gently. The inspector's brow furrowed. People do unexpected things as they age. Miss Marple, besides, she might have stepped out for a walk. Miss Marple glanced at the untouched tea, the perfectly arranged armchair, the neatness of the room, and left her knitting mid-stitch, with the back door unlocked. Grayson sighed. Perhaps she had an appointment she neglected to mention. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flickered to the mantelpiece. A small patch of dust where a photograph should have been. Subtle, but noticeable. She gestured toward it. A missing photograph. Inspector Grayson barely glanced at it. And perhaps she moved it herself. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, but she doubted it by early afternoon. News reached the village constable. Mrs. Pembroke had been found, or rather, her body had. The abandoned cottage at the edge of St. Mary Mead had been empty for years. Once belonging to a reclusive artist, it had since fallen into disrepair. It was here, in a small, dusty sitting room, that Edith Pembroke lay slumped in an old armchair, hands folded in her lap as though merely resting. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were bolted shut. A locked room mystery, Miss Marple said softly as she observed the scene. Grayson folded his arms. She must have come here on her own. Perhaps she took ill. Miss Marple knelt beside the chair. Edith's posture was too composed, too deliberate. Her dress was unruffled, her expression oddly serene, a death of quiet intent. Yet something was wrong. She peered toward the fireplace, where faint traces of ash remained in the grate. Something had been burned, and just outside, in the damp soil beneath the window, a clear set of footprints, larger than Edith's own. She did not come alone, Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Grayson exhaled sharply. Miss Marple, let us not jump to conclusions. She turned her keen gaze toward him. Oh, Inspector, I do not jump, I observed. She glanced once more at the locked door, the missing photograph, the careful arrangement of Edith's body. A puzzle, indeed, and one that did not fit together. Chapter 2. The Locked Cottage. Mr. Reith. News of Edith Pembroke's body being found in the abandoned cottage spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Villagers whispered in clusters outside the post office, at the grocer's, even in the small tea room. where Miss Marple sat, stirring her tea with thoughtful precision. "It makes no sense, Jane," said Mrs. Weatherby, her usual gossiping tone subdued with unease. "Why would Mrs. Pembroke go all the way to that old cottage? And how did she lock the door from the inside?" Miss Marple merely smiled faintly. "That is precisely the question, my dear." At the crime scene, Inspector Grayson surveyed the abandoned cottage with a skeptical eye. The wooden door had been broken open by the constable to retrieve the body, but before that, it had been locked from within, with the key still resting in the door. The windows were all bolted shut, the chimney too narrow for anyone to escape through. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "We'll confirm cause of death soon enough, but there's nothing obvious. No wounds, no signs of violence. It's possible she simply fell ill here." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the surroundings, finally spoke. "Inspector, do you see those footprints outside the window?" Grayson frowned, following her gaze. There, in the damp soil beneath the window, was a set of footprints, large, heavy, and definitely not belonging to Mrs. Pembroke. "Could be from a vagrant," Grayson said, but there was hesitation in his voice. "Or from someone who wanted to be sure she was inside," Miss Marple replied. "Tell me, Inspector, does it not strike you as odd that Mrs. Pembroke's body was found seated so neatly, hands folded in her lap, as if she had arranged herself before dying?" Grayson exhaled sharply. "If someone else was here, how did they leave?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she wandered inside the cottage, eyes flitting over the sparse furniture, the faint scent of burned paper in the air, and the undisturbed dust on the mantelpiece. Then she noticed something. On a nearby table, a small cup sat with its contents dried at the bottom. She touched the rim lightly. Tea cold, meaning it was prepared before her death. She turned back toward the inspector. "Inspector, was a teapot found here?" Grayson looked toward the constable, who shook his head. "No, ma'am. Only the cup." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Then, where did the tea come from?" As the afternoon stretched on, Miss Marple found herself walking past Mrs. Pembroke's cottage once more. The curtains were still drawn, just as they had been that morning. A sense of unease lingered. She decided to step inside once more. Everything was as it had been left except for one thing, the missing photograph from the mantelpiece. Someone had taken it. Miss Marple frowned. Mrs. Pembroke's son, Roger, had arrived earlier that morning, after hearing the news. She had noted his restlessness, his irritation, but had dismissed it as grief. Now she wondered. A knock at the door made her turn. Roger Pembroke stood at the threshold, his expression tight. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, "I heard you were looking into my mother's death." Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. "Oh, not at all, dear boy. I am merely observing." His jaw clenched. "The police said she likely wandered there herself. A tragic accident." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And you believe that?" Roger hesitated. "I believe my mother had secrets, Miss Marple, but I don't believe she killed herself. And I want to know what she was hiding." Miss Marple sipped her evening tea, her mind abuzz with questions. The locked door, the missing photograph, the footprints outside the window. And now Roger, certainty that his mother had secrets. Something did not fit. She set her teacup down carefully. If Edith Pembroke had been silenced, it meant someone was afraid of what she knew, and fear always left traces. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Bello Chapter 3, Secrets. In the hot morning after Edith Pembroke's body was discovered, Miss Marple found herself once again at the abandoned cottage, this time alone. The air carried the chill of damp stone, and a faint scent of burnt paper still lingered near the fireplace. She knelt before the grate, running a gloved hand lightly through the ashes. Something had been burned here, something recent. A few edges of charred paper remained, one with what appeared to be the faint outline of a letter's header. Carefully, she pinched the brittle remains between her fingers, a fragment of a name. Her lips pressed together. Someone had destroyed evidence, but not well enough. At the Pembroke cottage, Roger Pembroke was pacing the sitting room, agitation written across his face. Miss Marple had requested to speak with him privately, away from Inspector Grayson's skeptical ear. "I don't see why you're involving yourself, Miss Marple," Roger said impatiently. "The police have already drawn their conclusions, have they?" Miss Marple settled herself into a chair, smoothing her skirt. "Your mother was found in an abandoned cottage she had no reason to visit, with no obvious cause of death. and no clear explanation as to how she came to be there. I would hardly say matters are concluded. Roger exhaled sharply. She wrote to me before she disappeared. He admitted. A letter. But when I arrived, it was gone. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Do you recall what it said? Not precisely. But she mentioned something about setting things right and a secret she had kept too long. He hesitated. I thought she was just being melodramatic. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest. Your mother was not known for melodrama, Mr. Pembroke. The village was abuzz with speculation when Miss Marple arrived at the post office. Mrs. Weatherby, ever the eager bearer of news, leaned over the counter. More curious happenings. Miss Marple, I overheard Lillian Hargrove speaking with Mrs. Townsend this morning. She was the last person to see Mrs. Pembroke alive, you know. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Indeed. And what did she say? Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice. Something about an argument. A private matter, she called it. Miss Marple's mind word. An argument. The night before Edith vanished. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Lillian Hargrove. The woman greeted her with a wary expression, as though expecting the visit. I suppose you've come about Edith, Lillian said, leading Miss Marple inside. Miss Marple nodded. I understand you saw her on the evening of her disappearance. Lillian hesitated. Yes, she seemed troubled. She told me she had something important to do, but when I asked what, she grew defensive. Did she mention the old cottage? No, but she did say something curious. Lillian bit her lip. She said she should have told the truth years ago. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A secret, a long-held truth, and someone had silenced Edith before she could reveal it. The next morning, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Grayson at the police station. She placed the charred paper fragment on his desk. Someone burned this in the fireplace at the abandoned cottage, she said. It was important enough to destroy, but hurriedly done. The name on it, perhaps the recipient of Edith's last letter. Grayson leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You think she was silenced before she could reveal something? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. I think, Inspector, that we are dealing with the murder. Chapter 4. The vanishing letter. Miss Marple sat in her neatly arranged parlor, sipping her tea thoughtfully. The burned paper from the cottage still troubled her, who had been so desperate to destroy Edith Pembroke's words, and more importantly, what had she written? Her gaze flickered toward her window, where the world of St. Mary Mead bustled quietly on. She had a call to make. At the village post office, Miss Marple approached Mr. Jameson, the aging postmaster, with a warm but firm smile. Mr. Jameson, I wonder if you might assist me with a small matter, she said. Did Mrs. Pembroke send a letter shortly before her passing? Jameson frowned. Indeed, she did. I remember because she seemed quite anxious about it. Insisted I ensure it was posted immediately. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And do you recall the recipient's name? He hesitated. I'm afraid I don't, Miss Marple, but it was a London address. London. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Miss Marple made her way to Edith's home once more, where Roger Pembroke greeted her with wary curiosity. Miss Marple, he said, more questions. I wonder, Mr. Pembroke, if your mother kept copies of her letters. Roger blinked. Copies? No, she hardly ever wrote letters at all. Miss Marple smiled gently. And yet, she wrote one the day before she died, to someone in London. His brow furrowed. London, indeed, and I suspect whoever received it holds the key to her death. Roger's expression darkened. Then, we need to find out who. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage. It was a casual affair, but she had chosen it for one reason. Lillian Hargrove would be there. Settling herself beside Lillian, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation. I spoke to the postmaster today, she said, watching Lillian carefully. It seems Edith sent a letter to London just before she died. Lillian stiffened. I wouldn't know anything about that. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her voice. You were one of the last people to see her alive. She might have mentioned it. Lillian forced a smile. If she did, I don't recall. But Miss Marple had seen enough. Lillian was lying. The next morning, Inspector Grayson greeted Miss Marple with folded arms and a raised brow. I assume you've discovered something, he asked dryly. Miss Marple nodded. A missing letter, a recipient in London, and a woman who is not telling the truth about what she knows. Grayson exhaled. You suspect Lillian? Miss Marple shook her head. Not yet, but I do suspect she holds a thread to untangle this mystery. Grayson leaned back. So, What now? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Now, Inspector, we find out who in London was meant to read that letter. Chapter 5. A visitor from London. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking softly as she considered the problem. Before her, Edith Pembroke's missing letter was undoubtedly the key to her murder, but the recipient's identity remained unknown. However, the answer might soon present itself. If someone in London had indeed received the letter, they might come looking for answers. And Miss Marple intended to be ready when they did. Her patience was rewarded the very next afternoon. A stranger had arrived in St. Mary Mead, checking into the modest village in a tall, well-dressed man with sharp eyes and an air of quiet importance. Miss Marple wasted no time in making her way there. As she stepped into the dimly lit parlor of the inn, the man glanced up from his tea. He regarded her with mild curiosity. "Can I help you, madame?" Miss Marple smiled warmly. "I do hope so. My name is Miss Marple, and you, I believe, are the recipient of Edith Pembroke's final letter." The man hesitated, then gestured for her to sit. "My name is Charles Whitaker. I was a solicitor once, retired now." Edith Pembroke was an old acquaintance. Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And yet, you've traveled from London upon hearing of her death. That suggests her letter was of great importance." Whitaker exhaled. She wrote to tell me she had discovered something about her late husband, something that might change everything." Miss Marple's knitting slowed. "Her husband, but Mr. Pembroke has been dead for years." Whitaker nodded. "And yet, Edith was convinced she had uncovered something significant. She did not elaborate in the letter, only that she would explain in person." Miss Marple frowned. "And now she is dead before she could do so." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "Precisely." Inspector Grayson listened with arms crossed as Miss Marple relayed Whitaker's account later that evening. "So the letter had to do with her husband," he said. "That complicates things." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. The question is, what did she discover that was worth killing for?" Grayson exhaled. "We'll need to dig into Mr. Pembroke's past." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "And we must also consider who in the present might have wanted Edith silenced." The next morning, Miss Marple paid another visit to Lillian Hargrove. The woman was noticeably tense as she welcomed her in. "Lillian," Miss Marple said kindly, "you were one of Edith's closest friends. Did she ever speak of her husband?" Lillian hesitated, then sighed. "Not often, but recently she had become fixated on something. Said she had learned the truth at last, but when I pressed her, she refused to explain." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did she seem afraid?" Lillian swallowed. "Yes. That afternoon, Roger Pembroke confronted Miss Marple outside the post office. 'You've been prying into my father's past,' he said tersely. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I have been trying to understand what your mother discovered." Roger's expression darkened. "My father was an honorable man. Whatever she found, it wasn't worth her life." Miss Marple studied him. "Then perhaps we should find out who thought otherwise." Chapter 6. A husband's shadow. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, turning over the facts of the case in her mind. Edith Pembroke had uncovered a truth about her late husband, something so significant that it had cost her life. But what could that be? And who else had known? She decided it was time for a fresh perspective. And so, later that afternoon, she called upon the one person who might provide it, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Townsend. Mrs. Townsend welcomed Miss Marple with a knowing smile. "You've come about Edith, haven't you?" Miss Marple nodded. "I have. You knew her well. Tell me, what do you remember about her husband?" Mrs. Townsend sighed. "Mr. Pembroke was well respected, but I always found him secretive. He had an air about him, as if he carried a burden no one could see." Miss Marple leaned forward. "A burden?" Mrs. Townsend hesitated. "There were rumors, of course, that he had been involved in something unsavory before he married Edith, but no one ever spoke of it openly." Miss Marple's mind whirred. Could it be that Edith had finally uncovered what that secret was? Meanwhile, Inspector Grayson was conducting his own inquiries. He summoned Roger Pembroke to the station, placing a stack of old records before him. "We've been looking into your father's past," Grayson said. "It appears there were inconsistencies." Roger's jaw tightened. "Inconsistencies?" Grayson nodded. "His business dealings were not as transparent as they seemed. Some investments went missing, and yet no one ever questioned him." Roger exhaled. "My mother must have found out." Grayson folded his arms, which begs the question, who else knew? Miss Marple visited Charles Whitaker at the village inn. Her curiosity piqued. Mr. Whitaker, did Edith ever mention anything specific about her husband's past? Whitaker frowned. Only that she had proof. Something written. She planned to confront someone with it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone. Whitaker hesitated. I assumed she meant her son, but perhaps she meant someone else. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the Pembroke house. Roger Pembroke played the perfect host, but there was tension in his manner. Lillian Hargrove was there too, her eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple turned to Lillian. You knew Edith best. Did she ever mention what she had discovered? Lillian's fingers tightened around her teacup. She said it was something that should have been revealed years ago. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, and yet she never got the chance. As the evening drew to a close, Roger Pembroke stood by the fireplace, looking troubled. He caught Miss Marple's gaze. Do you think my mother's death was truly about my father? Miss Marple considered him. I think your mother found something dangerous, and someone made sure she never spoke of it. Roger exhaled. Then we must find out what she knew. Chapter 7. Secrets Unearthed. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, reflecting on the growing complexity of the case. The late Edith Pembroke had uncovered a dangerous truth, something tied to her husband's past ends. Someone had silenced her before she could reveal it. The pieces were forming a pattern, but she needed to place them correctly before the picture became clear. Determined to press on, she set out for another visit to Charles Whitaker, the retired solicitor from London, who had received Edith's final letter. He had to know more than he had initially let on. At the village inn, Whitaker was sitting by the fire, a newspaper in hand. When Miss Marple arrived, he looked up at her approach and sighed. I had a feeling you'd be back, Miss Marple, he said, setting the paper aside. Miss Marple took a seat across from him. Mr. Whitaker, I need you to be completely candid. Edith Pembroke must have given you some indication of what she had discovered. Whitaker hesitated. I only know that it had to do with money. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Money. Whitaker nodded. Years ago, before his marriage, Mr. Pembroke was involved in some rather questionable financial dealings. It was all swept under the rug. But Edith mentioned in her letter that she had uncovered proof that he had deceived certain people. Miss Marple leaned in. Did she say who those people were? No, Whitaker admitted. But I assumed it was connected to someone in the village. Miss Marple pressed further. Did she mention anyone specific? Whitaker hesitated before saying she did express concerns about Lillian Hargrove, said she felt guilty about something regarding her. Miss Marple sat back. Lillian had been one of Edith's closest friends, yet she had been evasive ever since the murder. Could she be hiding more than she let on? Miss Marple's next visit was to Lillian Hargrove's cottage. The woman greeted her stiffly, clearly uneasy. Miss Marple, I must insist that you be honest with me. Lillian. Miss Marple interrupted gently but firmly. Edith's discovery, was it about you? Lillian's face paled. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Edith said she felt guilty about something involving you. Lillian sat heavily in her chair. She discovered the truth about my father. Miss Marple remained silent, allowing Lillian to gather her thoughts. My father was a clerk at Mr. Pembroke's firm, Lillian explained. Years ago, there was a terrible scandal, missing funds, accusations. My father was blamed and dismissed in disgrace. But Edith must have found proof that it wasn't him, that it was someone else. Miss Marple nodded. And she planned to set things right. Lillian swallowed hard. Yes, and now she's dead. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited Inspector Grayson to share what she had learned. The inspector listened, frowning deeply. So, Pembroke framed Lillian's father. He mused. That would certainly be a motive for revenge. Miss Marple nodded. But revenge against whom? Edith wasn't responsible. Grayson sighed. Perhaps someone thought she would reveal something that should have remained buried. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Roger Pembroke. He had been unusually tense whenever his father's past was mentioned. Could he have been trying to protect the family name? The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the Pembroke estate. Roger greeted her with cautious politeness. I suppose you're here with more questions, he said, leading her to the sitting room. Miss Marple smiled. Just a few. She took a seat, her gaze steady. Roger, did your mother ever speak to you about your father's past? Roger's expression darkened. She never spoke of it when he was alive. But recently, yes, she started asking questions. Did that trouble you? Miss Marple asked gently. Roger hesitated. I just didn't see the point. He's been dead for years. Miss Marple watched him carefully, and yet, whatever she discovered was important enough to warrant her murder. Roger's fists clenched. You think I had something to do with that? Miss Marple shook her head. I think you know more than you're saying. Roger exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. She mentioned something about a bank account. One that shouldn't have existed. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. A hidden account, Roger nodded. She said it proved my father had been involved in something criminal. That evening, Miss Marple pieced the puzzle together. Edith had uncovered proof of her husband's past crimes, proof that could have ruined someone, but who stood to lose the most. She needed just one more clue. Chapter 8. The final piece. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, the fire crackling softly beside her. The evidence was mounting. Yet there remained one crucial missing link, one final detail that would bring the entire mystery into focus. Edith Pembroke had died because of a secret she had uncovered about her late husband, and now Miss Marple was certain she knew what it was. But knowing the truth was one thing, proving it was another. Determined to find the last piece of the puzzle, Miss Marple paid another visit to Inspector Grayson. The inspector, though often skeptical of her methods, had begun to respect her sharp intuition. I believe we are looking at an old crime with new consequences, Miss Marple began. Edith Pembroke's discovery was not just about financial misconduct, it was about something far more sinister. Grayson frowned. You think she found evidence of a crime more serious than fraud? Miss Marple nodded. I do. And I believe someone killed her to keep it buried. Grayson sighed. We've searched the house, spoken to everyone who knew her, and still, we've found nothing concrete. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. That, Inspector, is because you were looking in the wrong place. Miss Marple's next stop was the Pembroke estate, where she requested a meeting with Roger Pembroke. He was visibly weary, as though the weight of his mother's death had begun to press upon him. I need to know the truth, Roger, Miss Marple said gently. You mentioned a bank account. Your mother discovered one that shouldn't have existed. Have you found any records of it? Roger hesitated before nodding. I searched through my father's old papers. There was a ledger, tucked away in the back of his study. It listed several transactions, all under false names. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind was racing. And did any of those names stand out? Roger swallowed. One did. Charles Whitaker. Miss Marple wasted no time in confronting Whitaker at the village inn. He had always appeared the perfect gentleman, polite, measured, and seemingly uninvolved. But now she saw the cracks in his facade. I know about the bank account, Mr. Whitaker, she said without preamble. I know about the transactions, the false names, and I know that Edith Pembroke had proof. Whitaker's face turned a shade paler. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I believe you do. You were more than just a solicitor to Mr. Pembroke, weren't you? You were his accomplice. Whitaker's hands trembled slightly. That's a dangerous accusation, Miss Marple. Miss Marple tilted her head. Not if it's the truth. Back at the Pembroke estate, Miss Marple gathered the key players, Roger Pembroke, Lillian Hargrove, and Inspector Grayson. She had the final pieces of the puzzle. And now it was time to put them together. Edith Pembroke discovered that her husband had been involved in fraudulent dealings, Miss Marple began, but it was more than that. He had a partner, someone who helped him conceal his crimes. That person was Charles Whitaker. Roger looked stunned. Whitaker, but he's a clever man, Miss Marple finished. Clever enough to stay out of trouble all these years, until Edith found out. Lillian gasped. Then he… Yes, Miss Marple said softly. He killed her to keep his past hidden. Inspector Grayson nodded. We'll bring him in for questioning immediately. Chapter 9. The Noose Titan's village was abuzz with whispers. Charles Whitaker's arrest sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, a place where such scandal was a rare event. Yet Miss Marple, seated comfortably in her parlor with her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, knew the case was not yet closed. There remained a nagging feeling, a piece that didn't quite fit. Inspector Grayson, though pleased with the arrest, was well aware of Miss Marple's reservations. He met her at the station to discuss the evidence. Miss Marple, you've been instrumental in unearthing this conspiracy, he admitted. But you don't seem entirely convinced. We have our man, Miss Marple sighed, setting down her knitting. Inspector, I fear we may have caught the fox but overlooked the wolf. Grayson frowned. What do you mean? The evidence against Whitaker is compelling. Yes, Miss Marple said. But the manner of Edith Pembroke's death, quick, calculated, and precise suggests something more personal. Whitaker had every reason to want Edith silenced. But was he truly capable of murder? Grayson leaned back. He's an intelligent man. If he thought his secret was about to be exposed, Miss Marple shook her head. Then why such a clumsy mistake? Edith wrote a letter to him, a letter that still existed. If he were as careful, as we suspect, would he not have destroyed it? Grayson rubbed his chin. So you think someone else acted, perhaps even using Whitaker as a convenient scapegoat? Miss Marple nodded. And I believe the answer lies within the Pembroke estate. Roger Pembroke had become a shadow of himself in recent days. The revelation about his father's past, followed by his mother's death, had weighed heavily upon him. When Miss Marple arrived at the estate, she found him brooding by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in hand. "Roger, my dear, you mustn't lose yourself in sorrow," Miss Marple said gently. Roger looked up, his expression vacant. "What else is there? My family name is ruined. My mother is dead. And now this scandal." Miss Marple sat opposite him. "Roger, I must ask you something difficult. Did you ever confront your mother about what she had discovered?" Roger's grip on his glass tightened. "She was restless in her last days. Kept talking about making things right. I told her that digging up the past would do no good." Miss Marple observed him keenly. "And did she tell you about the bank records?" Roger hesitated before nodding. "She did, and I begged her to leave it alone." Miss Marple sighed. "You were afraid of what it would do to your family's reputation." Roger swallowed. "Yes." Miss Marple left the estate deep in thought. Roger had been defensive, but was it simply grief and pride or something more? If Whitaker had not acted alone, then who had truly wielded the knife? Her next visit was to Lillian Hargrove. The woman had been quiet since the arrest, and Miss Marple suspected she was holding something back. "Lillian dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you and Edith were close. If there's anything you've been keeping from me, now is the time to say it." Lillian looked torn. I didn't think it was important, but the night before she died, Edith came to see me. She was terribly agitated." "What did she say?" "She told me she had made a terrible mistake, that she had trusted the wrong person." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Did she say who?" Lillian hesitated. She mentioned Roger." Armed with this new revelation, Miss Marple met with Grayson again. "Inspector, I fear we have arrested the wrong man," she declared. "Whitaker was complicit in fraud, yes, but the true killer is someone closer to the Pembroke family." Grayson looked grim. "You think Roger killed his own mother?" Miss Marple nodded. "He had the most to lose. If Edith exposed the truth, their family's entire legacy would crumble. And we mustn't forget it. This last words were about trust. She had confided in her own son." Grayson exhaled. "We'll bring him in for questioning." Chapter 10. The truth revealed. Roger Pembroke sat in the dimly lit interrogation room of the village station, his face pale but composed. Inspector Grayson leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, observed every twitch and hesitation with the patience of a cat watching a mouse. "Mr. Pembroke," Grayson began, "your mother's murder has shaken this village. We now have evidence that suggests you may have had a hand in it." Roger's jaw clenched. "That's preposterous. I would never harm my mother." Miss Marple spoke, then, her voice soft but firm. "Roger, Edith trusted you. She came to you with what she had found, believing you would help her. Instead, you begged her to stay silent, and when she refused," Roger shook his head violently. "No, you're wrong. I was trying to protect her. She was so fixated on my father's past that she couldn't see how dangerous it was." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Dangerous for whom? You or her?" Across the village, Lillian Hargrove sat by the fire in her cottage, staring at the flickering flames. She had given Miss Marple the final piece of the puzzle, but now she wondered if she had done the right thing. A knock at the door startled her. It was Charles Whitaker. His normally composed expression was tight with worry. "They've arrested Roger," Lillian whispered. "Do you think he?" Whitaker sighed. "I don't know anymore. I thought I understood this whole mess, but now..." He trailed off, lost in thought. Lillian bit her lip. "Charles, is there something you're not telling me?" Whitaker hesitated, then met her gaze. "There's something I found. A letter one Edith never sent." Back at the station, Miss Marple read the letter Whitaker had handed over. It was addressed to Roger. "My dearest son, I know you are frightened, but we cannot live in the shadow of lies any longer. I have decided to go to the authorities. I pray you will stand with me, but even if you do not, I must do what is right, but with love, mother. Grayson looked up. She knew he might not support her. Miss Marple nodded, and she was right to be afraid. Roger buried his face in his hands. I didn't kill her, he murmured. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but there was steel beneath. Then who did? Roger, because she was murdered by someone she trusted. Roger hesitated, then whispered, Lillian. Chapter 11. The last confession. Lillian Hargrove sat alone in her cottage, staring at the flickering candlelight, her fingers trembling as she held a worn photograph of Edith Pembroke. The air was thick with unspoken words, guilt settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had hoped that by keeping silent, she could bury the past, but now, with Roger's accusation, there was no more hiding. Inspector Grayson and Miss Marple arrived at her doorstep just as the church bell tolled in the distance. Lillian opened the door slowly, her face drawn but composed. Miss Marple, she said softly, I knew you would come. May we come in, dear? Miss Marple asked gently. Lillian nodded and stepped aside. As they entered, Miss Marple observed the small sitting room, neat but lived in. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, scent that Edith had always carried with her, a subtle reminder, perhaps, of the friend she had lost. Lillian poured tea with steady hands, but when she sat down, her fingers gripped the teacup too tightly. You were Edith's closest friend, Miss Marple began. You knew all her secrets. Lillian sighed. She was like a sister to me. Miss Marple's expression softened. That's why you couldn't let her ruin everything, isn't it? Lillian's breath hitched, and she set down her cup with a slight clatter. I never meant for this to happen. Grayson leaned forward. Tell us everything. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. Edith came to me that night. She was frightened but determined. She told me she was going to the police with what she had found about her husband's fraudulent dealings. I begged her not to, because it wasn't just her husband's name at stake, was it? Miss Marple prompted gently. Lillian shook her head. No, it was mine too. Grayson exchanged a sharp glance with Miss Marple. Explain. Lillian exhaled shakily. Years ago, Edith's husband helped me out of a desperate situation. I signed documents for him without understanding what they truly were. If the truth came out, I would be implicated as well. Miss Marple nodded. And Edith, good-hearted as she was, did not realize that by exposing her husband, she was also exposing you. Lillian buried her face in her hands. She wouldn't listen. She said she had to make things right. Grayson's voice was firm. So you killed her. Lillian's shoulders shook. I didn't mean to. We argued. She turned to leave. And I grabbed the letter opener from the desk. I only meant to stop her, to make her listen. But the moment it happened, Miss Marple said softly, you knew there was no undoing it. Lillian nodded, tears falling freely. I panicked. I staged it to look like a burglary gone wrong. But when I saw Roger was being suspected, I couldn't bear it. Chapter 12. Justice and Clasera. Lillian Hargrove sat motionless, her tear-streaked face pale under the dim light of the cottage. The weight of her confession hung in the air, suffocating in its finality. Across from her, Miss Marple regarded her with a mixture of sorrow and inevitability, while Inspector Grayson prepared his notebook, his expression unreadable. You understand what this means, Miss Hargrove. Grayson's voice was steady, but carried the authority of the law. Lillian nodded slowly, staring at her hands. I have nothing left to hide. Miss Marple's voice was gentler. The truth has a way of surfacing, my dear, no matter how deeply buried. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, but she didn't argue. I loved Edith like a sister. I never meant for this to happen. Grayson sighed, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Miss Hargrove, I must take you into custody. A long silence followed. Then, without protest, Lillian held out her wrists. The metal cuffs clicked into place, a stark reminder that justice, however painful, would be served. That as Lillian was led away, Miss Marple remained in her seat, deep in thought. It was over, but something still nagged at her, a puzzle piece that felt slightly out of place. Miss Marple. Grayson's voice pulled her from her reverie. It's done. Miss Marple nodded, standing slowly. Yes, though I fear there are still wounds that will take time to heal. Back at the Pembroke estate, Roger Pembroke sat in his father's old chair, staring at the fire. When Miss Marple arrived, he barely looked up. She killed my mother, he said hollowly, and I accused Charles. Miss Marple sat across from him. You acted out of grief and suspicion, Roger. No one can blame you for that. Roger let out a bitter laugh. No one. My family name is tainted. My mother is gone. And all because of lies and greed. Miss Marple observed him carefully. Your mother sought to right a wrong. In the end, she stood for truth. That is how she should be remembered. Roger exhaled sharply, looking away. Perhaps days later, the village returned to its quiet normalcy, but the echoes of the crime lingered. At the church, a small memorial was held for Edith Pembroke. Miss Marple stood in the back, watching as the village paid its respects. Charles Whitaker approached her afterward. You were right all along, Miss Marple. Miss Marple offered a small smile. I had my suspicions, but the truth only emerges when one listens carefully. Whitaker hesitated. I owe you an apology. I should have trusted you sooner. Miss Marple patted his arm. The important thing, Mr. Whitaker, is that justice was served. As the bells chimed softly overhead, Miss Marple turned away, walking down the path that led back to her little cottage. Content that another mystery had been solved. Final reflection, the case was closed. The guilty were held accountable, and the village returned to its peaceful routine. But Miss Marple knew that human nature, with all its complexities, would always present new puzzles to be solved. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.